On 1+1 this week, it's not easy talking about it, but at some stage everyone deals with grief and loss. We bring you three very different and moving perspectives. Hello, I'm Jane Hutcheon. Welcome to the program. Rhonda Brighton Hall is a human resources specialist with the retail banking division of the Commonwealth Bank. Her job is about making teams work more efficiently and effectively, and she always enjoys the challenge of changing company cultures. She has two daughters, but nothing could prepare Rhonda and her husband Michael for the very personal challenge of giving birth to a son, Hugo, who was diagnosed with autism by the age of 3. The family was living in Chicago at the time, but have since moved back to Australia, where last year Rhonda won a Telstra Businesswoman of the Year award. Rhonda Brighton Hall, thanks so much for speaking with 1+1.
It's an absolute pleasure, thank you.
About 10 years ago, you had a son, Hugo, and he was autistic. Can you tell me how you came to know he was autistic?
Yeah, Michael and I have two daughters too, so Sarah and Grace. Sarah's 4 years older than Hugo and Grace was 2 years older, and they had spoken very early and they were very articulate, and they still talk too much like their mum and dad and they're still very articulate, but Hugo didn't, and so he started to speak, and then by the time, so 18 months he was starting to speak, and by 2 he had stopped. And so it's funny because you remember the first word your child said, but you don't remember when they stopped saying it. And so at 2 we started to go, oh, his speech is gone. So we were living in Holland at the time. I was working in Europe, and we went to a couple of doctors and things and said, look, our son's not speaking like he should speak at 2. And they said, oh, he's a boy, you're comparing him to girls. And he was very, very hard to diagnose. So for the next 12 months we spent a lot of time, and this is so common for parents of autistic children, we spent a lot of time actually finding out what it was, because Hugo had two things that autistic people aren't meant to have. One, he was very affectionate, and the second one, he was empathetic. So he would respond to your emotions and try and make you happy. And traditionally, autistic people don't do that. So they kept saying, well, he can't be autistic because he's affectionate, because he's empathetic. And then by the age of 3, we had just moved to Chicago in the States, and we had him diagnosed within a week of being there, just on his 3rd birthday.
Did you know exactly what autism was then?
I think we didn't, and we wanted to ask a lot of questions, and we've been incredibly fortuitous a number of times in our life, and in Chicago was one example of that we had a few days before Hugo was diagnosed, a beautiful little boy called Jacob. One of our neighbours had walked up the street and he'd said, hello, Mrs. Brighton Hall, do you live in Sydney? And I said, yes. And he said, do you know you have the largest steel stand bridge in the world with so many tonnes of metal? And I said, no, I didn't know that. He said, and I can name every street east to west in our neighbourhood. And then he named 20 streets. He said, goodbye, and off he left. And then a few minutes later, his mum came up, Deb, who's now a great friend of ours, and she said, did you meet Jacob? And I said, oh, yes, outrageous, he's so much fun. And she said, he's Asperger's.
He had Asperger's. That has some relation to autism.
It's on the autistic spectrum, and it's the high functioning, and it's very different than Hugo's, the way that autism played out for Hugo. So with Jacob, he was Asperger's. He was incredibly clever and a beautiful piano player. But if you say to Jacob, write a story, he's going, about what? And create characters, who? So they don't have the creativity element of that often. And that's the thing about autism, is it's so unique to every child. So there isn't like the textbook you go and pull out and say, okay, they've got autism type 1, I'll do this. They're on a spectrum, and your life as a parent becomes about changing their life and making it as good as it can be. And I think that's what autism has been like for a lot of people. It's very sad, it's a tough diagnosis, but there are so many more things that are worse. And it's about getting going, and you can make a really big impact as long as you get going quickly.
It's something that has to be managed. How difficult was it to manage?
I think the best way to look at it is while it's tough on a parent or a sibling or something like that, it's so much tougher for the person who is on the autistic spectrum. I mean, it's tough to deal with someone who can't communicate, but imagine if you couldn't communicate. It's tough to not know how to get what you want, but imagine if you couldn't tell anybody about it. Is it tough? Sure. I mean, there are some funny times. We had some hilarious times with Hugo that are fabulous stories that, we can laugh about a lot now. But we also had tough days.
Were you constantly worried that something would happen to him?
Yeah,
something
the doctor,
before him?
Dr. Ches, who's one of the world leaders in autistic research, or that we had worked with Hugo when we were in Chicago and subsequently when we were back here, he said to us, we went to a parents' evening one night, and he told us the two things that I think stayed in the back of our head for a long time. The first one was that autistic children live their whole life. They can live like you and I to an old age, with the exception, and the only thing that's really a threat to them is misadventure. It's that sense of curiosity and putting themselves in dangerous positions. And the other thing he told us, which is another part of living with autism, is we were in this lecture and he said to all these trainee neurologists, you'll notice that there are 8 people up the back. I've invited 4 parent sets from parents of autistic children at dinner. I want you to talk to them because you need to understand you're not dealing with a child's brain, you're dealing with a family. And he said, and the divorce rate for parents of autistic children is 96%. And all of us gasped, except Michael, my husband, said really loudly, well, you've got to love a challenge, haven't you? Okay.
So he needs constant vigilance.
Constant. With an autistic child, you have one eye on that child all the time, every time.
You sadly lost Hugo last year. Can you tell us about that?
We had an accident at home, and it's very, very sad. And we don't talk about the actual accident. It's sort of, we decided as a family that we had 9 years of this fantastic influence in our life and like a gift. And he taught us so much about so many things that to dwell on the last little piece was the wrong way to look at it.
I wonder, knowing that he was autistic before and constantly worrying about him, when the accident happened, was there a feeling that, I knew that was going to happen, I should have watched out? I'm just wondering what kind of feelings went through your head at the time.
I think, we've talked to other parents who've lost a child, and I don't think it's unique to children of autistic children, but it's you do feel what if, or I could have, or if we'd been there or something. And then gradually over the last 12 months, as we've thought it through, we've probably rescued Hugo 100 times. We just missed one. So I think you let go of what you could have done, and you think, well, I rescued 100 times, and yeah.
A lot of people would ask, how do you bounce back from something like losing your son?
It's a good question. We decided, and I think this is also fairly common of parents who've been through a similar circumstance, is you have to get over yourself and look after your other children and get life back on track very quickly, and I think we did that. Having said that, what Hugo taught us during his life was true just after his death too, and he taught us an amazing connectivity to the people around you if you're open to them. So if we met 3 people who were quite rude to us about an autistic child, we met 1,000 people who weren't. And after Hugo passed away, a really good friend of ours gave us a note, and she said we had a party at our house after the service, and she gave us a note and she said, look, I've gone round your friends and family, and this is the next 5 weeks, and we'll be cooking for you, and at 5 o'clock every afternoon someone will bring a meal for the 4 of you, and if you've got extra people, ring us and we'll bring extra. And if you don't want to talk to us, just open the gate and we'll give you the food and leave you. And if you do want to talk to us, invite us in. Mobile number's there, and if you don't want to see us, call us. And for the next 5 weeks after Hugo passed away, we didn't cook a meal. And people just embraced us, and that's how it's been since he was born.
If I could ask you to explain what loss is to you, how would you describe it?
It's an interesting question. What is loss to me? I think it's the plans and opportunities that you had that are gone.
Where do you think you are at the moment in terms of grieving?
It's funny, we've just to the point a couple of weeks ago we've gone back and contacted Aspect, and Aspect is a not-for-profit that looks after autism in Australia, a fabulous group of people. And we've contacted them and said, look, for a long time we've been doing quiet advocacy and helping parents of autistic children in the background. We'd really like to be part of it now, and if we can do something more constructive or more useful to you, we'd love to do it. I mean, autism is such it's not cool, and so it doesn't have a face, and it isn't spoken about. And I've spoken to a great friend of mine who does a lot of work with mental health, and it's a little bit close to that. These are tough problems, and they're not pretty, so it's hard to talk about. But when you have an autistic child, you don't have any time. It is 24/7. And so to have that experience and understand that emotion and understand what they have to work with, but not to have the time commitment of Hugo in our lives, we can actually use that time to help these guys who've still got that issue in their lives. We're at that stage now where I think we're going to use what we've learnt to do something good back, and I think that's a good place to be.
What kind of effect has it had on your family?
I think it's had a huge impact on us. He changed the way that you think about a family, because you've got someone that you constantly have to put first. And I think if you meet my daughters, they're so generous and so caring, and they're always looking for how they can help people. And I think that's from having Hugo in their lives. If you look at Michael and I and our marriage, our friends will always say, "Wow, I wish I had a marriage like yours." And part of that's because it's very generous. It's not about what can you get back, it's about giving out all the time, and you get a lot back when you do that. So it's a very, very close family, and we've stuck together really beautifully.
Rhonda Brighton Hall, thanks so much for speaking with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
When actress Natascha McElhorne was told that her 43-year-old husband had died of a heart attack, she said it was how she imagined war to be. Pregnant with her third child and reeling from the shock, she began writing a series of letters to him, talking about how she and her two older sons were trying to cope with their loss. 2 years on, those letters were published in a book called After You. Philip Williams met with Natascha McElhorne in London.
Thank you very much for joining 1+1. You've written an intensely personal, searing account of the loss of your husband unexpectedly. Did you ever think that could possibly happen, that your experience, your intense experience, could in some way be helpful for other people?
It just feels